For many years, it was presumed that in ancient Egypt, the Great Pyramids at Giza were built by many thousands of foreign slaves, toiling under very harsh conditions over a period of decades. Today, many scholars refute this picture of ancient Egypt, believing instead that they were built by the free Egyptians themselves, some perhaps as seasonal conscripts with other artisans consigned permanently to the projects. One must also consider just how the Egyptians would really control so many slaves in one location with the rudimentary weapons of the Old Kingdom. A slave is defined as one bound in servitude as the property of a person or household. This is an interesting definition, considering that it does not refer to entities other than persons or households, such as the state. The definition of slavery does provide that it is the state of one bound in servitude as the property of a slaveholder or household, which seems to have a broader scope. Certainly most of us would consider anyone bound in servitude, regardless to whom, a slave. In ancient Egypt, textual references to slaves are indistinct. From word usage alone, it is difficult to ascertain whether one was a slave or a servant. For example, a priest could be read as a god's slave, but by our definition and understanding of slavery he was not. In reading Egyptian texts, therefore, context is the only criteria for determining such a status, and even then, it can be difficult, because there were different levels of servitude. Those who were not free might not only include slaves, but also those with various degrees of encumbered liberty. For example, could an artisan who worked on tombs who lived in the Deir el-Medina workers' village on the West Bank at Thebes simply walk of his job? In effect, almost anyone under the authority of an absolute ruler such as a pharaoh might in some degree be considered a slave. We should also note that, if it is difficult to identify slaves from textual references, it is even harder to do so with depictions. In fact, the term that conjures up anachronistic visions either of ancient Rome or of the 19th century plantation of the New World do little to help understand slavery in Egypt. Most of the population of pharaonic Egypt were tied to the land or followed strictly hereditary professions. These men or women were often included among the possessions of kings, high-ranking officials or temple estates. Serfs might better describe these people, though even that term is too closely connected with images of feudal society in medieval Europe, especially in view of the fact that Egyptian farmers were tied to the land not so much legally but by tradition and economic circumstances. For ancient Egypt, a better, or at least more precise definition of a slave might be a person owned by a master, as was any other chattel, used as the master pleased, to the extent of being disposed of by inheritance, gift sale and so forth. In reality, such slavery seems to have been fairly rare in Egypt prior to the Greek period, progressing over time. Like all ancient population statistics, estimating the number of slaves in ancient Egypt is based more on guesswork than on knowledge. In pharaonic times their part in the population may have been greatest during the expansionary stage of the New Kingdom, when whole populations were enslaved at times. Thutmose III, for instance, is reported to have returned from a campaign in Canaan with almost 90,000 prisoners. Given the small size of armies usually numbering in the thousands rather than tens of thousands of soldiers, most of these prisoners must have been civilians. There is one collective noun, written with the Hosein hieroglyphic, that refers to groups of people who belong to individuals and institutions such as temples. As early as the Old Kingdom, such groups were mentioned along with land and cattle. During the Middle Kingdom, we also know that they could be acquired by bequest or other arrangements. During the New Kingdom, they could be recruited from captives or given in an endowment. Considering their apparent permanent detachment to the land and their master, they were almost certainly a form of slave. Another similar term, written with a canal sign, appeared to denote another group of people assigned to individuals and institutions, but who were not directly connected with land and cattle. Though we know little about this group of people, they may have been similar or the same as the king's slaves who, during the Middle Kingdom, were often transferred to estates of priests, nobles and officials. The king's slaves were considered the property of their master, but their occupations were not confined to agriculture, as they were also employed in households. We believe that their children undoubtedly inherited the status of their parents. Captives depicted at Medina Habu, almost certainly being led into slavery. In Egypt, as well as elsewhere, the principal and oldest cause of slavery was capture in war. Specifically in Egypt, the general rule was that all captives, including those outside of the military forces, became a royal resource. The king certainly did not keep all of these slaves, though some were resettled in colonies for labor. However, he also granted some of them to temples, to meritorious individuals, and also as booty for his soldiers. From ancient documents, we know that as many as 19 captives could be assigned to an individual as slaves, including both male and female. Temples, on the other hand, could receive an unlimited numbers of captives as slaves, and some references mention many thousands. Also, a trade-in, possibly captured, people from foreign countries was also possible. For example, Amenhotep III ordered 40 girls from Milkalu, a Canaanite prince, paying 40 kit of silver for each. Behold, I have sent you Hania, the commissioner of the archers, with merchandise in order to have beautiful concubines, that is weavers, silver, gold, garments, turquoises, all sorts of precious stones, chairs of ebony, as well as all good things, worth 160 dublin. In total, 40 concubines, the price of every concubine is 40 of silver. Therefore, send very beautiful concubines without blemish. From the Brooklyn Papyrus, we learn that Near Eastern men and women were intermingled with Egyptian servants and outnumbered them. Interestingly, they seem to have been more highly regarded than their Egyptian counterparts. This is probably due to the fact that, as prisoners of war or their descendants, they initially belonged to a social stratum superior to that of the Egyptian servants. In fact, the Egyptians of similar status probably came to be slaves due to committing some sort of unlawful act. Hence, some of the Egyptians who became slaves were originally free people who, having committed some sort of illicit acts, were forced to forfeit their liberty, perhaps including the liberty of their spouse and children. It should also be noted that the birth of a child to a slave mother, whether or not the father was free, resulted in slavery for the child. In fact, abandonment of undesired newborn children was not infrequently practiced in Egypt and the Near East, and has also been attested in Greco-Roman Egypt. Though there seems to be no extant documents of such a practice in Egypt, elsewhere foundlings were considered ownerless property who might be picked up to become slaves.